thank you everyone for attending, the panelists and the attendees on Zoom and those watching on different platforms. So it is panel 2, which was under the title, The Evolving Gulf Interventions and Policies Toward the Conflict in Yemen. We have 4 papers that will be presented by 4 speakers. But I believe after we have seen the titles of the papers that will be presented, it might be more precise to talk about the evolving regional interventions and policies toward the conflict in Yemen, because we will have 2 papers here that will be presented. The first paper from Majid Ansari about the Houthi-Iranian relationships, and another paper from Dr. Dania Waffer, how can the Saudi-Iranian talks affect the situation in Yemen? So it will be more precise to talk about the evolving regional, not Gulf interventions toward the conflict in Yemen. So the first session is posing a challenge for us because we will have to be as disciplined as they were. We have 4 speakers, and I believe it is possible to be disciplined. 2 of the speakers, we have recordings of their presentations that we will present. Because of emergency travel conditions, they are unable of joining us live, but they have recorded their presentations and we will present them to you. So we will start with a paper from Nadwa Ad-Dawsari concerning the Houthi-Iranian relations and the development of the Houthi movement. Nadwa, for those who do not know her, she is a very well-known researcher. She is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. Before joining the institute, she was the Yemen country director for Center for Civilians in Conflict. She's worked as a founding director of Partners Yemen, which is a local affiliate center of Partners Global. She has long experience in program management for the National Democratic Institute in Yemen and managing elections, monitoring and tribal conflicts programs. She has over 20 years of field experience in Yemen, where she conducted extensive research, providing deeper insights into the internal dynamics of the conflict in the country. And her publications have been featured by the Middle East Institute, Carnegie Endowment, the United States Institute of Peace, the Atlantic Council, and others. Nadwa has a master's degree in development studies from Leeds University and bachelor in English from Sana'a University in Yemen. So we will have her presentation. If you can play it.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. So I will be talking about the relationship between the Houthis and Iran, which is one of the most misunderstood notions in the Yemen war. It's either exacerbated, claiming that the Houthis are puppets of Iran, or it's downplayed, claiming that the relationship only evolved because of the war, or only established because of the war. So, and it's really critical to understand the relationship in order to understand, in order to, in order to understand its impact on the conflict in Yemen. So when Biden lifted the FTO designation of the Houthis, the expectation was that the Houthis will reciprocate by de-escalating their military offensive, but the opposite happened. What happened is that the Houthis escalated attacks inside Yemen, pushing hard to capture the oil-rich Marib governorate, which is the last stronghold of the government, but they also stepped up their cross-border attacks inside Saudi Arabia. And in order to understand the behavior of the Houthis and their action, it is important to understand their political ideology, their relationship to Iran, and their end game. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what is Houthis' political ideology? Houthis' political ideology is deeply rooted in a strong religious belief that only Ahlul Bayt, which is a religious term that refers to the bloodline of Prophet Muhammad, have a right to rule over Muslims. Ahlul Bayt in Yemen, we use 2 words, 2 terms, either Hashemites or Sayyids. The Houthis are motivated by the desire to reinstate the imamate, which is a theocracy that ruled Yemen, parts of Yemen, for hundreds of years until it was overthrown in 1962. But more importantly, the Houthis are inspired by Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurists, which is a system of governance that was established by Ayatollah al-Khomeini following the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Abdul Malik al-Houthi, which is the father of the Houthi, Abdul Malik al-Houthi was the current leader of the movement. He is the brother of the founder of the movement. He is described by the group as the guardian of the Quran, and Alam al-Huda. Alam al-Huda translates as the icon of guidance, which means that he is a supreme leader who was chosen by God and who is entitled to absolute and unconditional obedience from his people, which is very different from Zaydism. And that's why it's a mistake to describe Houthis as Zaydis. Zaydism is the opposite of Houthi ideology. It allows revolting against the ruler. In this case, it's the opposite. The Houthis demand unconditional obedience to their leader. In fact, the Houthis sidelined Zaydi scholars and even prosecuted and eliminated some of them because they were not in agreement with giving the Houthi leader that kind of sacred, status. So what is the relationship of the Houthis, between the Houthis and Iran? Again, the Houthis' actions are largely inspired by the Iranian Revolution. They seek to replicate it in Yemen with Iran's help. Iran has seen its gains from decades of slow yet consistent investment in the Houthis realized over the past 7 years, thanks also to the mistakes and the way the Saudis have completely mismanaged the war. But Iran's support to the Houthis goes back to the 80s. Training, indoctrination, asset recruitment, and gathering intel were part of that. The father of the movement, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, was strongly inspired by the Iranian Revolution and was committed to import it. In one of his lectures, he described it as the best example to follow in order to confront America and Israel. He and his father spent time in Iran in the 1980s and 1990s. So when he came back, Hussein al-Houthi managed to inject himself into the Zaydi revivalist movement, and later he hijacked, militarized, and radicalized the Zaydi revivalist movement, turning into the Houthi movement. And the movement have suffered a split between the Zaydi scholars and the Hussein al-Houthi group, which Zaydi scholars believed was radical and more political rather than religious. So while the Zaydi revivalist movement had a domestic agenda, which is to curtail the spread of Wahhabi Salafi education in the Zaydi areas in the north, Hussein al-Houthi and the Houthi movement leader and his group had a regional agenda, which is the fight against the enemy of Islam, which is America and Israel, and also to import the Iranian Revolution model into Yemen, which the Zaydi scholars were not on board with, or most of the Zaydi scholars of the day. So Iran has also provided the Houthis with military support. And this did not start during the current war, as many believe. In the years leading to the 2004, which is when the war between the Houthis and the government started, Houthis have started, in the years leading to that, Houthis have started stockpiling weapons. A document from 2005 showed that an Arab-speaking IRGC commander, Abu Hadi, developed the training manual which he used to train the Houthis on how to fight urban warfare and capture cities. This is 2005. Later, Abu Hadi visited the Houthis in Beirut before sending them to Iran. And hundreds of Houthis have spent time in Iran during that time, or between that time and now. And following the Arab Spring, Hezbollah started training and helping the Houthis organize. Over time, Iran increased its direct engagement with the Houthis, not just through Hezbollah. by providing financing, training, military expertise, political organizing, and communication, as well as, of course, weapons. By 2014, Iran admitted that it had few hundred military personnel from Quds forces in Yemen aiding the Houthis. One of them is Abu Riza Shahlai, who was sanctioned in 2008 for establishing Iran's proxies in Iraq. He has been in Yemen since before 2014, according to local tribal leaders from Sada. In 2019, Hassan Nasrallah spoke with pride about Hezbollah's martyrs who died in Yemen fighting, with the Houthis. Iran provided the Houthis with weapons and weapon manufacturing technology. Now they have missiles, they have drones, which hit very important targets inside Saudi Arabia and most recently Abu Dhabi. But Iran also helped the Houthis establish a governance system, building a police state that is akin, the system in Iran. The Houthis constructed a regime that corresponds to their aspiration to replicate the Iranian revolution system. It's highly repressive system. The same methods of intimidation that IRGC used in Iran to control the population and eliminate opposition following the Iranian revolution, Houthis are using now, it includes executions, forced disappearance, torture, rape, etc., etc. But also, Iran helped the Houthis, and more so Hezbollah, establish the preventative security, which was described by the UN panel of experts as the most influential intelligence apparatus for the Houthis. And the mission of this apparatus, it reports directly to Abd al-Malik al-Houthi. It's a parallel system, but it's very powerful, and its mission is to ensure loyalty and eliminate any potential opposition and threats, as particularly from among the Houthi, group. And again, Hezbollah helped establish that preventative security system, even when the Houthis were still in Sada. So before the war, the preventative security had played a key role in eliminating former President Saleh in December 2017, and his main leaders from Saleh party who were in Sana'a then. Also, what the Houthis have done is indoctrination of children. Hundreds of thousands of children are forced to attend indoctrination camps every year, particularly in the summer. Last year, they announced that they are recruiting 600,000 children to be in the summer camps. They've also changed the curriculum and injecting their political ideology into the education system. And the materials are based largely on Hussein al-Houthi's lectures, which are guided by principles of the Iranian Revolution. The Houthis are also a very important member, a key member of the axis of resistance, Iran's axis of resistance. They are on on a Quranic path that does not aim only at controlling Yemen, but also Mecca and to liberate Jerusalem. And no, that is not propaganda. That is what Houthis believe they can do. And they are sure they can do that. They believe that God is on their side, and you don't blame them, because over the past 7 years, they have made a lot of military, gains and sort of defeated their enemies. And so that reinforced the idea that God is on their side and they're on, a sacred path. Doesn't matter what the sacrifices are, they believe that they will eventually reach their goal. So where does that leave us and the policy community? Denying Iran's link with the Houthis or downplaying it or exacerbating it, for that matter, is not helpful. Doesn't matter what the policy, goal, what the goal of analysts or activists. It's not helpful to not face the truth. It is also a mistake to assume that Houthis are pragmatists or that there is a chance for Saudi Arabia to contain them with money or diplomatic negotiations. Clearly, that has not worked over the past 7 years. The Saudis have been talking with the Houthis since 2015. And it is true that Houthis are not Iran puppets. They're not Iran puppets, but Houthis and Iran are solid allies. They're unbreakable. Houthis are a key part of Iran's expansionist agenda. Both Iran and the Houthis aspire to expand beyond Yemen and throughout the region, and the eyes are on Mecca and Jerusalem. This is not, again, this is not rhetoric. They say that, but it's not rhetoric. It's their end game. And failing to recognize that will not only lead to misguided policies, but it will likely contribute to, to interventions that will prolong the conflict in Yemen and fail to address the regional security threats that the Yemen war has caused and is causing. So I will leave it at that. And I'm very sorry again, I will miss the Q&A, which is usually my favorite part. But I apologize again for not being able to attend. Thank you.
شكرا مرة أخرى للأخت ندوى وكما ذكرت هي تعتذر كثيرا عن
Thank you, Nadwa. And as she said, she apologizes for not being with us in the session. And we appreciate her recording of that paper. And as I have indicated, it's great that we have this technology, and the pre-recording actually allows us to control the time. So we'll move now to the second paper, which will be exploring the evolving Saudi and Emirati policies toward Yemen in 2020. It will be presented by Christian Kotz-Richsen. I apologize for the pronunciation. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and he is a Baker Institute fellow for the Middle East at Rice University. His research focuses on rule of law and due process in Middle East and Arab Gulf countries, the issues of internal security and stability. Before that, he was a member of the research group at the Middle East Center in London School of Economics and Political Science, and he currently serves as the affiliate professor at the University of Washington. He has a PhD in history from University of Cambridge, and his research includes United Arab Emirates, power politics and policy making, and Qatar and the Arab Spring. You have the floor, Dr. Christian. You have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for having me speak at this conference. Thank you very much for the papers so far. It's a pleasure to be with you. Nadwa mentioned about the mismanagement of the Saudi-led intervention. And of course, that is Saudi-led with a significant UAE component, which I'm going to talk about in my brief time today. And we've had a divergence of Saudi and Emirati policies in Yemen, at least since 2016. We had at the beginning of the intervention, at least the UAE playing a major role in pushing Houthi forces out of Aden in the summer of 2015 and out of Mukalla in April 2016. But over time, we have seen persistent challenges of different threat perceptions. The Saudis face a threat on their southern border of incursions from Houthi militants on the other side of the border, of consistent attacks of a very different nature that the UAE only recently has had to begin to face. We've also faced different expectations of what military or political success would look like, what types of political actors would be or should be part of the eventual post-conflict political landscape in Yemen, with the Saudis and Emiratis also focusing on different groups of Yemeni actors as well, and potentially also desired outcomes. And we've seen in numerous instances, both in terms of Saudi negotiations with the Houthis, or dialogue at least with the Houthis, the on-off dialogue, and also between the Saudis and the UAE in their dialogues and in the agreements signed by forces and groups in Yemen that have links to different Saudi or UAE patrons. We've seen on both cases, we've seen difficulties with sequencing of agreements, who moves first, how far and how fast, and also lack of trust. And we saw that both in terms of the difficulties in implementing the Riyadh agreement between the Hadi government and the Southern Transitional Council in 2019. We've seen the continuing challenges of moving towards any form of political resolution to the various conflicts in Yemen. I would argue that 2019 has had an impact, and we've had an evolution of Saudi and UAE policies since then. Not only the difficulties of implementing the Riyadh agreement within Yemen, but also the fallout from the escalation of tension in the wider region. And again, talking about the regional issue that our host began the panel with, in terms of the failure of the US maximum pressure campaign to deter Iran from resisting and of course from striking targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE in 2019, which really, I think, for the Saudis and Emiratis did have a very big impact, both on their willingness and their desire to keep going with the interventionist assertive policies that we had come to get used to from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi between 2014 and roughly the end of 2018. We had in 2019 a UAE redeployment, which was spun quite heavily by officials and others as a withdrawal, but wasn't completely a withdrawal. It was a different format of supporting forces in Yemen financially, logistically, with weapons, but not necessarily directly with UAE forces. And it was a very pragmatic move, I think, by the UAE, creating also a perception of distance between Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh, and also creating a perception of distance in Washington, recognizing and reading the room that the conflict in Yemen was becoming an extremely politicized issue in Congress. We had attempts to restrict the sale of weapons to the protagonists. And of course, after the death of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, the Saudi image in Washington became toxic for a time. It perhaps still is. So we also began to see UAE attempts to try to create a degree of or perception of distance between their position and Riyadh's position. And it was quite successful in the sense that a lot of the backlash against the intervention in Yemen has been focused on Saudi forces, on Saudi Arabia's presence, and not so much on the UAE. So it was a pragmatic position also, I think, from the UAE, recognizing that a military outcome was not possible, and that from a UAE perspective, they had at least secured influence. They had secured a sphere of influence in many parts of Yemen that mattered to them, and they were going to cut their losses, at least in a military capacity. What we've seen from the Saudis, especially from 2019, is a desire to see a phasing down of the conflict, but also one that allows the Saudis to be in the driving seat, to not look like they have suffered an operational military strategic defeat. They want to be seen, I think, to be the ones driving the negotiations, on top of the negotiations, able to secure negotiations with milestones that Mohammed bin Salman can then present to the Saudi people domestically as a series of, if not wins, then at least a series of outcomes that are consistent with Saudi interests, however they may be defined, and not look like they have been outmaneuvered, outfought, and cannot defeat an enemy that is, in many conventional ways, much weaker than the Saudi force should be. The difficulty there, of course, has been that the Saudis haven't been winning. That until very recently, it's been the Houthis who've had the upper hand, and the Saudis have been perhaps struggling to match their desire to phase down the conflict with the realities on the ground. I think the Saudi government leadership has wanted out since at least the September 2019 attacks on Al-Qaeda. The difficulty, of course, is how to get there. And we see also the challenges of, especially in Washington, defining what constitutes offensive or defensive military support. And of course, we see there the sort of the contours of the current discussions and dynamics over the US role in Yemen too. The UAE has been chastened, I would argue, by the limitations of its ability to project power beyond its borders. We mustn't forget also that not only since 2019 in Yemen, but also in Libya, where Khalifa Haftar launched his offensive to take Tripoli in the spring of 2019, that also failed. That also invited a counter-mobilization by Turkey in the Libyan case that really raised the cost to the UAE and its local supporters of their kind of interventionist activities. Of course, we're speaking today when President Erdogan is receiving a 21-gun salute in Abu Dhabi, which shows how things can change. We've seen, so from a UAE perspective, the desire to at least draw back perhaps from that antagonistic, assertive interventionist approach, perhaps born out of a recognition that it was beginning to create too many challenges and obstacles. And we've seen, of course, the several manifestations of that. We've seen the UAE dialogues with Iran that began within weeks of the attacks on shipping and energy targets in 2019. We saw, of course, the winding down of the blockade of Qatar, the UAE getting on board with Saudi attempts to at least resolve that issue at the end of 2020. And we've seen the Saudi dialogue with Turkey, which again has been construed as part of a regional rapprochement. The UAE very much reading the room, trying to find different ways to project influence, given that its ability to project power outside its borders is perhaps not as strong as the Emirati leadership in 2015, 2016 may have thought, and is now beginning to really kind of have a backlash. And we have, of course, seen over the last month that backlash become manifest in extremely visible and direct ways for the UAE with the missile and drone attacks on Abu Dhabi. And this is a degree of backlash for the UAE that is quite different from, say, the 2019 attacks linked but never conclusively attributed to Iran, which were on offshore targets. It was on ships in the Gulf of Oman, or it was on energy targets, which often are far from population centers. But when you have anti-missile defenses opening up over Abu Dhabi and waking everybody up, and people posting videos to social media of drones and missiles being intercepted, that's a whole new level of direct visual backlash. And I would argue that the recent attacks, if they are from the Houthis, as we believe they probably are, they are difficult for the UAE to accept for three reasons. One is they're a very direct reminder that for all the attempts since 2019 to say that the UAE has withdrawn from Yemen, that the UAE is still heavily involved in the Yemen conflict. And of course, as I said before, the Saudis have until now taken the brunt of international backlash to the war in Yemen. This is a reminder that the UAE is still very heavily involved. Secondly, it's hit the image of the UAE as a safe place to live, work, and do business, as how people like to put it, a kind of an island of stability in a much more wider arc of regional instability. So it's hit that image, especially if the attacks continue. Of course, the Saudis have been under attack since 2016, at least, with regular missile and drone attacks on infrastructure. We just saw one at the weekend against an airport in Abha. But Saudi Arabia is a much larger country, and the UAE has a much higher focus on services, on international communities, which may begin to take flight if these escalate and continue. And finally, I think it's also shown, the recent Houthi attacks, that this time around, there will be a backlash for the UAE in re-engaging in Yemen. In 2015 and 2016, UAE forces were instrumental in pushing back the Houthis from Aden and from Mukalla. But after that, the bulk of the fighting against the Houthis really devolved onto Saudi and Saudi-backed groups. The UAE focused on supporting groups in southern and western Yemen instead. By moving the Amalika Brigade to Shabwa, by moving it into Marib, the Houthis have sent a message to the UAE that if they get involved this time, there will be a cost to pay. And I think it's a cost that wasn't anticipated by the policymakers in Abu Dhabi, the fact that the first attack actually got through the air defenses. Clearly, the air defenses since then have been able to intercept subsequent attacks. But it's a message that I think, unlike 2015, unlike 2016, this time in 2022, there will be a cost to pay if you get heavily re-engaged in the fighting, especially on the Houthi fronts. So finally, how might policies evolve? Well, the UAE is this year and next year, 2022-23, on the UN Security Council, which could offer the UAE a platform to try and build regional and international support. Of course, the instinctive response to the most recent attacks has been to try and mobilize that support for the redesignation of the foreign terrorist organization against the Houthis. But the UAE does have a platform, an institutional platform, to try and seek and build coalitions of actors on the international level. For the Saudis, they remains the same, I think, the same issue. What level of strategic and security assurances can the Saudis get, not just from the Houthis, but from their international partners, to give the Saudi leadership the degree of confidence that they can withdraw and not face continuing instability, potentially attack? And I think they're not there yet either. And finally, as many others have said over the last year, ending the fighting, reaching a ceasefire is not the same as ending the whole range of political, economic, security, military challenges facing Yemen. So it cannot just be a one-off reaching a ceasefire. There's got to be a much wider package of assistance and sustained engagement. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian, for sticking to the time, and you raised a lot of questions in my mind, at least, but also in the Q&A window. So we'll come back with a lot of questions to you. But before we do that, خلينا ننتقل إلى الدكتورة دانيا ظافر.
We can move on to Dr. Dania Waffer for the third paper that will be presented during this panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Dania, for being with us and for participating in this conference. The paper that she will present will be how Saudi-Iranian talks affect the war in Yemen. We all know that there have been rumors of formal and informal talks that are being hosted in a number of countries between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Dr. Dania is the executive director of the Gulf International Forum, which is an institute based in Washington, D.C., and provides analysis on political, economic, social, and security issues of the 6 GCC countries, in addition to Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. Her expertise is on the Gulf region's security, U.S. Gulf relations, and the political economy of the GCC states. Dr. Dania has many articles published in international media like the New York Times, Financial Times, BBC World, the Washington Post, and many others. Dr. Dania holds a master's degree in political science from New York University and a PhD in political science and specialized in political economy and international relations of the Arab Gulf states from the American University in Washington. Please go ahead, Dr. Dania.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Arab Center, DeepRoot Consulting, and the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies for inviting me to speak today. As mentioned, my talk will address how the Saudi-Iranian dialogue in Baghdad could affect the Yemen war, which is an elusive quest with all the escalation going on right now, but I'll do my best. I first wanted to touch upon some broader regional trends in the region. Last year marked 40 years since the establishment of the Gulf Cooperation Council. As many may know, it was primarily the establishment of this institution was primarily as a reaction to the Iranian Revolution. And today the institution not only has the same challenges, but has many new new threats to its unity. Now, across the Gulf region, major players are realizing and have realized actually that the marginal gains for conflict is diminishing. Yet there is an increasingly uncertain future, especially in reference to the Yemen conflict. And so there were major regional factors that kind of shifted the foundations here. As everyone knows, after COVID, the Gulf states realized that they really need to dial down the cost for conflict and tensions and focus more on diversification, reform, and growth of their economies. The Al-Ula agreement was really important for intra-GCC de-escalation, which arguably helped de-escalation region-wide throughout the Middle East. And after the Gulf crisis, the balance has really tipped more favorably towards opportunities for dialogue between Iran and the GCC, because half of the GCC favors dialogue, namely Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman. Yet, I would still like to underscore there is still a shared fear of Iranian expansionism throughout the Middle East. Another factors that shows reconciliation, I think Dr. Ulrichsen addressed it, but reconciliation between Turkey and some of the GCC states. From the perspective of the GCC, the Arab Spring threat has diminished as regrettably the last supposed democratic country, Tunisia, is really backsliding towards more authoritarianism. And we have the Biden administration, which has finished its first year. And the decade-old consideration of reevaluating the US commitment in the region and the continued negotiation to re-enter the JCPOA in Vienna are big factors and considerations for some of the calculations for decreasing conflict in the region. And we also have the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Tehran and Riyadh have held 4 rounds in Iraq. Really, Saudi Arabia described it as cordial but exploratory, while Tehran says that they've gone a good distance. Really, the only visible, tangible outcome of these talks so far is Saudi granting visas to 3 Iranian diplomats to this Jeddah-based Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Noteworthy, it's not a Saudi organization, but I guess you could say it's a small positive gesture. The Saudis have, that I have spoken to really about Iran-Saudi talks are not very optimistic. And as I mentioned, it didn't really produce any real tangible progress. And so the fundamental tensions between Saudi and Iran really remain unresolved. There's a circuitous conflict trap region-wide between the 2 rivals. And really, sorry for the lack of optimism, but I know I'm not really convinced by some of the arguments posed about confidence building measures on soft issues, for instance, climate change or piracy, would really ease tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran to the extent that it would help the situation, especially in Yemen. Saudi Arabia and Iran, as many of us are aware, have backed opposing sides throughout the Middle East, in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, and this is ongoing for quite some time. And despite Iran being isolated internationally and having quite harsh sanctions, Iran has really showcased its determination to expand through proxies or non-state actors or partners throughout the Middle East. And from the vantage point of the GCC states, they feel like they're being surrounded. Another important issue to Saudi Arabia and to other GCC states is Iran's ballistic missile program. And those that follow the issue are very aware that it's a difficult one to tackle giving Iran's unwillingness to relinquish its missile capabilities, especially in the face of an overwhelmingly, considerably superior Western military capabilities in the GCC neighborhood. So this one is probably a non-go. While current Saudi-Iranian talks have been ongoing, perhaps an optimistic outlook would be to take note that both parties have really increased their leverage through different pressure points. The Saudis' diplomatic role with Lebanon, and importantly, their withdrawal of financial support for the country was really a mechanism to put pressure on the Iranian proxy Hezbollah. Meanwhile, the Houthis also have escalated their missile launches onto Saudi territory, not to mention the recent iteration in the UAE. And also, let's not forget that the Saudi-led coalition also has been bombing Yemen. So there are various policies of the GCC states when it comes to Yemen. And these are a function of different factors that affect their geopolitical standing, such as security and threat perceptions, economic interests, and different political cultures. For Saudi Arabia, Yemen is a key and important strategic issues. The Saudis view the prospect of Houthi dominance as an existential security threat at their southern border. Yemen is viewed to be yet another front in which Iran has gained influence, and a front for destabilizing activities from Saudi's view. So shifting it to the current context, from the Saudi perspective, in my opinion, one cannot really separate the JCPOA negotiations and dialogue from Saudi and Iran's talks and the Yemen conflict at this point. The Saudis view the Iranian threat to be more imminent now than 2015 and believe that one component of increased threat perception is the Yemen war. That's a huge escalation for how the region was prior to 2016 or 2015. And from their vantage point, when or if the US re-enters the JCPOA, they will lose leverage with the Iranians. And this largely is related to why you probably can see some ongoing talks. Actually, there's been a small pause in the talks, but I presume there might be some continuation. The Iranian influence on the Houthis, in my opinion, is overstated, and I think many scholars would agree with that. Iran really is a booster for Houthis, but I don't see Iran as the principal foundation of Houthi power. And although a hard security issue, more than confidence building measure, Yemen really is a good starting point for negotiations. It has been reported anyway that the Yemen conflict was among the main topics discussed by Saudi Arabia and Iran and Baghdad. The Yemeni front is arguably low-hanging fruit in comparison to other conflict areas between Saudi and Iran. And I say in comparison, I don't think it's that easy to resolve for obvious reasons. But for the Saudis, resolving the Yemen conflict, as I mentioned, is of high importance. It is believed that Riyadh is asking Tehran to withdraw support from the Houthis and it to agree to a ceasefire and negotiations. For the Iranians, although Iran has supported the Houthis, it has few stakes in Yemen, really. Yemen is more than 1,000 miles away from Tehran, separated by multiple sea and land borders, and really makes it, I won't say an acceptable concession, but more so than other conflicts region-wide. Yet we all know that Iran is known to keep its strong links with its allies, partners, proxies in the region. And it is noteworthy that they have expanded rather than scaled down. And this is the trend that can be witnessed across the region. Therefore, it would really be naive to think Iran would delink itself from the Houthis. Yemen does present an opportunity where Saudi and Iran can agree on certain issues. And, I do agree that right now the situation has escalated at a very high level. But Iran, let's say hypothetically speaking, if they talk about Yemen, Iran can make an agreement on the security of southern Saudi Arabia. Now, how can they make this agreement? Probably the main concern is the Houthi missiles. Noteworthy to mention, it's really still unclear if the Houthis can really sustain a missile program itself without the support of Iran and its proxies. However, an agreement would solve that issue, but it would not solve the Yemen war. I think there's when we discuss the conflict in Yemen, there's often a conflation of different aspects of the conflict as it pertains to Iran's influence, which can offer insight, I think, to pressure points for Saudi and Iranian negotiation with regards to Yemen. One component is where the Houthis are sending missiles onto Saudi. Now, this is, I think, an area that Iranians may have more leverage or influence on. The other component is, the war between the Houthis and the Hadi government, which we know the Houthis are kind of backed by the Iranians and the Hadis backed by mainly Saudi, which Iran has kind of, and I just still want to clarify that Iran has boosted the Houthis. But if Iran really would have withdrew from the Houthis, like completely withdrew its support, I would still argue that they would still control a big part of Yemen. And so I think Iran has less influence in this aspect of the conflict. So right now, with the intense escalation of both sides of the Yemeni party, it seems as if Yemen is in a conflict trap. The most optimistic interpretation would be that all parties in the war are working to increase their leverage at this point in order to consolidate more bargaining power at the negotiation table, but that is very optimistic. And so I would like to leave you with a quote from Thomas Schelling, an international relations scholar. Diplomacy is bargaining. It seeks outcomes that, though not ideal for either party, are better than the alternatives. And really, what are the alternatives at this point? I think Saudi really wants to get out of this war. It spent enormous amounts of money and has not made the progress it aspired, while its international image is being tarnished. Most importantly, the suffering of the Yemeni civilians caught in the crossfire intensifies, making this really the worst humanitarian crisis globally. And the areas under Houthi control will continue to be bombed, and it makes it harder to sustain their position. So there'll be more discontent, angst, desperation among the Yemeni people. And so I'll conclude by I think it's way overdue for a diplomatic solution for the war.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dania. Shukran, Dr. Dania.
Thank you, Dr. Dania, for this important presentation. And we always go back to the question that we always think about, amongst Yemenis at least, of can a Yemeni solution contribute to making a solution or a settlement between Saudi Arabia and Iran easier, or would there have to be Saudi-Iranian rapprochement for a solution to the Yemeni crisis? And this is something that we can discuss at length more during the Q&A session. But for us not to waste any more time, let's move on to the fourth paper by Dr. Majid Ansari, and he also apologizes for not being for the sudden and abrupt changes to his schedule and being unable to join us today. So he also recorded his presentation. Dr. Majid Ansari is currently the head of the Qatar Academy for Security Studies, and he has a master's degree and PhD in sociological change from Manchester University. He speaks on a very important issue, which is on Gulf mediations in Yemen. We know that after 2011, there was the GCC initiative that was proposed in Yemen. This is what led to an end to the conflict in 2011 and with the beginning of the transitional period from 2012 to 2014. In his paper, Majid talks about the different forms of mediation, whether by Kuwait's mediation or Qatar's mediation, and different regional international crises, and how this mediation could be utilized more effectively in Yemen. If my colleagues working on the technical issues can please start the presentation by Dr. Majid.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. And I would like, first of all, to apologize for not being able to be here in person. And I'm sure that the discussions on this session and all the sessions of the event will be enlightening. And I look forward to reading the material after the event has concluded. Today, I would like to talk about our paper, which is labeled The Comparative Analysis of GCC Members' Mediation Activities, the Case of the Yemen Crisis. As we all know, the situation in the Gulf has developed quite exponentially in the last year, and there are a lot of moving parts and new variables that have come into play, and that, of course, has shed a lot of light on the Yemen issue. So today we will try to think of an answer to the question: who is a viable mediator within the GCC members who have experience in mediation, who can play a mediation part in the Yemeni case? We will talk about mediation and Gulf politics in general. We will examine Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates as viable candidates for mediation, and try to look at their past experiences and their prospects for conducting mediation in this crisis at the moment. And then we will end with a typology of GCC mediation activities. As we stated, this is a comparative analysis, so we are looking at all these states and their experiences with Yemen, with mediation, and their current status towards the conflict. And of course, we know that there are varying views and positions. We cannot compare, for example, Saudi Arabia, that is a part of the or the main partner of the Arab coalition in Yemen, to, let's say, a country like Kuwait with minimal interaction with the Yemeni case, and therefore this comparison will help us shed light on the different characteristics of each of these players. And we will try presentation and all throughout the paper to look at the challenging geopolitical atmosphere around the GCC countries and how that might affect their the possibility of reaching a conclusion through mediation to this crisis. The foreign policy interests, as we all know, of the countries we are discussing here diverge. This tendency, of course, was seen very clearly in the Arab Spring, in the Gulf crisis, and in the Yemeni war itself. All members of the GCC are in one way or another party to this conflict, either as being directly or indirectly linked to the ongoings of these conflicts. And therefore, their ability to play a role in resolution will also, through mediation, will also be hampered by the roles they play in these crises. So let's begin with Kuwait. Kuwait historically has been a successful mediator, not only in the regional sense, but in the international sense. However, in the beginning of the war in Yemen, it actually was part of the wider coalition that began this war. And therefore, they did provide military support to the anti-Houthi campaign. However, since 2016, of course, Kuwait has changed its position exponentially through hosting a UN-led mediation activity, which lasted more than 3 months. As a result, Kuwait today is seen as a peaceful and trusted actor in Yemen, although it did play a part in the coalition in the beginning. Now, while highlighting Kuwait's mediation activities, we should consider it as a party to some critical issues. In Egypt, in Syria, and Yemen, Kuwait was an actor, while in the GCC crisis attempted to maintain the role of mediator. And therefore, Kuwait is not a passive player in the region. It is quite an active player. In many cases, it did not, especially after 1990, it did not play proactive roles in major conflicts in the region, but it was always there one way or another, either as a supporter of other parties or as taking a political position, like in the Palestinian issue, for example. And of course, through its humanitarian aid and humanitarian activities. In this sense, it would be wrong to see Kuwait as an actor with a neutral foreign policy, like Oman, for example. Neutrality is not a trait that Kuwaiti foreign policy can be described with very successfully when it comes to its role with different issues. But however, Kuwait is also less involved than some other players in the region, i.e. Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. When we move to Qatar, like Kuwait, Qatar also has a long history of being a mediator state, albeit earlier than, or at a later point than Kuwait. We have seen it in Afghanistan, of course, most recently, but we have seen it before in Syria, in Lebanon, in Sudan. Qatar has successfully mediated between different parties, at sometimes, of course, more successful than others. The humanitarian diplomacy mediation nexus is more visible in the Qatari case, where aid, economic development, and mediation kind of go hand in hand. We have seen this happen in Sudan, we have seen it happen in Lebanon, we have seen it before happen in Yemen in previous conflicts. And there is a focus on soft power instrumentation in the mediation process, how to use soft power. Qatar has always used its soft power, media, in QFD or the National Aid Agency, all have played parts in supporting mediation activities that Qatar has done in the past. Qatar mediation activities also can be linked to a desire to overcome being a small state. It's very clear that there's a need or a want to push above its weight, and this could go actually for Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, but we have seen it more clearly with Qatar, especially in the 2000s. And the mediation activities have been affected by political crisis in the region in general. So we have seen Qatar, when it is party to a crisis in general, like the GCC crisis, that does affect its mediation role, does affect its roles within different conflicts. As, for example, the beginning of the Yemen war, Qatar was coming out of a diplomatic crisis with its neighbors when ambassadors of the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia were recalled from Qatar in 2013. And that conflict was resolved in 2014 through the reinstating of the ambassadors. Following that, there was a period where Qatar was more accommodating to Saudi Arabia's regional agenda. We have seen this happen with the Yemen war, where Qatar has agreed to participate in the Arab coalition and actually sent active forces to the border of Yemen, refusing to be involved within operations that are in the Yemen, on Yemeni soil, but albeit participating through being on protecting the or participating in the protection of the Saudi border. What is more likely that Qatar can play a role as a mediator than it was a year ago, for example, because Qatar was expelled from the Arab coalition in 2017 and has not done any active role since then in the Yemeni case. It is still, its image in Yemen is tarnished by its, first of all, support for Saudi Arabia and the Arab coalition in the beginning of the war, but also through its perceived relation with the Houthis, because Qatar in previous conflicts have played a mediation role and has hosted Houthis for many times, and Al Jazeera is hosting Houthi speakers and has been doing so for the past 4 years, which has always been seen as less of a impartial position on the sector. Moving to Oman, Oman has always been perceived as a more silent, more neutral mediator in the region, and this is why in some Western circles it was dubbed the Switzerland of Arabia. Oman has never been a country that is very flamboyant in its mediation activities and its political activities abroad. It has a very quiet diplomacy. We have seen this happen in the Iranian case, where it was very instrumental in reaching the JCPOA deal through its role as a go-between the United States and Iran. We have seen also this impartiality be very clear in the Arab Spring, especially with Syria, where Oman did not sever relations with the Syrian regimes, did not take a hard position against the Syrian regime, unlike most of its GCC partners. And therefore, this diplomatic independence showed by and restraint shown by Oman has helped it become a more successful mediator, albeit less of a proactive mediator. Now we have seen, of course, a lot of activity on the side of Oman in the Iranian case, but very little on other regional issues as to play the role of mediator. It has attempted to play that role in Yemen, of course, through its hosting of Houthi and Saudi delegations. Also, we should keep in mind that there is a historical role for Oman in the situation in Yemen in general. One side of it is its relation to the cross-border tribes in its border with Yemen, but also its conflict with South Yemen. And that is sheds a light also on its relations with the Houthis and with the other parties in Yemen. We should also be careful not to exaggerate the neutrality of the Omani side. Bordering Yemen, of course, sheds a light on making Yemen a direct national security issue for the Omanis, and therefore they have a direct stake in what happens in Yemen, especially in that border region. But also the strong relationship with the Houthis, as compared to the other parties in Yemen, does shed light on its neutrality. That said, Oman remains, of course, a very viable candidate as a mediator and has begun doing that and did that for a while between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. When we talk about Saudi Arabia, of course, the big elephant in the room is that Saudi Arabia is the instigator of the war on Yemen, and in support, of course, of the legitimate government of Yemen against the Houthi uprising, or the Houthi takeover of Sana'a. And while it is the initiator of the conflict in that respect, it is experienced in conflict resolution and mediation, especially in Yemen. Actually, the first time Saudi Arabia played that role was in 1949 as a mediator between Syria and Lebanon, and has went on to do more mediation, of course, in different conflicts. And it reached even outside the region, for example, between India and Pakistan at one point. And more similar to Oman, was more quiet when it comes to its mediation, did not have a lot of fanfare around its mediation activities, but was certainly quite visible. And the sheer size of Saudi Arabia, the regional leadership role that Saudi Arabia plays, of course, means that as a mediator, they don't come in as a neutral, impartial player. They come in as a strong regional player that uses that power to effect a successful mediation. However, it is very difficult to consider Saudi Arabia as a mediator for one reason, of course, the leadership of the current coalition, but also, historically speaking, in 1994, Saudi Arabia did not support the unified Yemen prospects at the time. and had good relations with South Yemen, and this goes back to the war even during Nasser's time. So there was always a position in Saudi Arabia. The border with Yemen and the historic relationship with Yemen, as Saudi Arabia in its inception annexed part of the historical Yemen at the time, makes it very difficult to consider Saudi Arabia as an impartial mediator in the Yemeni sense. We have seen less, of course, maybe that has changed in the past 2 months, but we have seen less offensives against the Houthis since 2018. So it cannot play a role of mediator, but it's certainly instrumental in the end to the crisis in Yemen and finding a final solution in Yemen. The GCC resolution that took place after the Arab Spring is certainly a place where Saudi Arabia was very interested. When it comes to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE wants to overcome the disadvantage of being a small state also, just like Qatar and UAE and Kuwait. However, the UAE shares a similar threat perception with Saudi Arabia against Iranian influence, which makes their position and their participation in the situation in Yemen partial rather than impartial. The Arab Spring has accelerated the UAE's foreign policy initiative that was based on militarization of its foreign policy, and therefore took a very hard perspective. And historically, the United Therefore, we can break down the dispute characteristics according to objectives. So if we look at the duration of the conflict, the level of intensity, and the nature of the problem, we can see that there is very clear characteristics for this crisis. When it comes to the duration, it is related to the length of the war. The longer a battle lasts, the less likely the conflict will be a peaceful resolution, and this war has went on for quite some time. And therefore, successful mediation would be quite difficult. As we see in the Yemeni case, mediation activities are affected, of course, by the length of the crisis. When it comes to level of intensity, of course, we are talking about a full-scale wall and bombardment and a huge number of deaths and humanitarian issues, which make it quite intense. And when it comes to the nature of the problem, we have an ideological, security, territorial side to this problem, but there are also cultural, tribal sides to it, which makes it even more complicated. To say the least, according to these characteristics, we are talking about quite problematic situation for any mediator to get into. When we talk about the typology, we can look at this table over here. If we compare the countries at hand with the different variables, the mediation frequency, for example, we see that Oman has conducted 46 mediations in its time, 18 for Qatar and 14 for Saudi Arabia, and we were unable to come up with a number for Kuwait, but quite a number of them certainly. We've seen Saudi Arabia focus on interstate mediation, while Qatar has focused on civil conflict and hostage release more, and Oman on civil conflict and interstate both. Motivations, we can assume that Saudi Arabia has hegemonic motivation for mediation, bandwagoning for the UAE and Bahrain, and survival and geopolitics for Qatar, while neutrality for Oman. And we can see the same with other variables, as you can see in the table, which will be available for you to read after. If we look at the characteristics of the mediators themselves, there are three main things to consider. One is impartiality, the other is leverage, and the third is status. And therefore, if we are talking about impartiality, of course, impartiality provides a better situation for the mediator, which means that Oman and Kuwait are the least involved from a military perspective, and therefore they would be more likely to be successful mediators, including, of course, Qatar is another player, but because of the role Qatar played in the beginning, certainly makes that quite more difficult. When it comes to leverage, of course, we have seen very clearly that no country except perhaps Oman has full leverage over the parties in the Yemeni war, and obviously because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quite positioned anti-Houthi, they wouldn't have the same leverage over other parties. When it comes to status, mediator has to have the power and or the general status to conduct mediation. In this sense, it is possible to say that the most advantageous actors in terms of status are Oman and Kuwait because of their status as mediators, successful mediators, and a strong belief in the mediator image of Oman in the literature. We have seen that very clearly. And Kuwait's successful mediation in Yemen before. Qatar, on the other hand, has a status that needs to be rebuilt after the Arab Spring as less impartial and more actively participating in different. Finally, it can be concluded that the Yemen crisis damages all parties' image as mediators. We have seen how all the parties don't have a very clear positive position as mediators in the Yemeni perspective. Throughout the crisis, neither Saudi leadership nor its allies exhibited their ambitions for dominance. Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait fulfilled their mediation efforts to enhance their credibility in this area, and based on this, we provide reasons for ineffectiveness of mediation in the Yemeni problem. The reasons for the failure of mediation in Yemen is twofold. Objective, because of the dispute characteristics itself, which makes it quite difficult and quite problematic as a case in general, regardless of the geostrategic sphere around it. And subjective, from the media characteristics, we don't see a clear mediator that can play a successful role with being impartial and having the status in the same time to enact a final resolution. When we look at the above items, these two classifications, we can see that the factors facilitating the GCC countries' mediation activity in Yemen are weak. Another problem is that the Yemen quagmire positions small state mediators as mailmen and decreases the possibility of any mediation activity, and this undermines, obviously, the effectiveness of small state mediation. First, small state mediation suffers durable and resilient solution for crisis, and second, the geopolitical orientation in the Gulf undermines the ongoing mediation activities. For instance, while Oman's power over the Houthis is an advantage for the mediation, Saudi Arabia's desire to isolate the Houthis movement and hindrance of mediation activities create a quagmire in which Oman and Kuwait cannot offer effective mediation. To sum up, it is a pessimistic view of possible mediation in the Yemeni crisis. It might become a reality on the ground in the coming months, but certainly we don't see, according to this evaluation, any of the players in Yemen being in the Gulf being poised to be good mediators in the crisis at hand. Thank you.
شكرا للدكتور ماجد ونعتذر عن تجاوز الوقت.
Thank you, Dr. Majid, and we apologize actually for taking so long. I said that it is an advantage to have recordings, but in this case, it was not an advantage. Anyway, as indicated by, we don't have Dr. Majid and Nadwa to respond to the questions, and time is upon us, so we will take two questions. Some asked about this presentation and the possibility of sharing it with other presentations. To remind you, all these papers will be published, will be revised, refined, and published in a booklet, and therefore you will see them all in a booklet. We had some questions here to Dr. Majid. Sadly, we cannot respond to them. We will take two questions, and the first question is to Dr. Christian about the UAE and Saudi policies. Sometimes during the past years, we have seen many people saying that there is a distance between the Saudi and the Emirati policies towards Yemen. Sometimes it's confrontational. In your estimation, do you think in 2022 that the Saudi and United Arab Emirates policies and their objectives in Yemen, will they be more aligned or divergent?
Thank you for the question. I think the challenge has always been that even when there was a perception that Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman were working closely together, a decision that would be taken between them at the highest policy level would then be transmitted downwards for implementation through two very separate chains of command, a Saudi chain of command and a UAE chain of command. And so by the time you got to the situation, quote unquote, on the ground in Yemen, the same decision could be quite differently implemented and put into place. We also saw, I think, a lack of engagement at medium and lower levels between Saudi and UAE officials, even within the coalition. I don't see that that has necessarily changed. I think at the highest level, there has obviously been a whole range of other issues that have put a degree of distance between the Saudi and Emirati leadership over the past year, instances of economic competition, for example. Obviously, the pandemic has made it more difficult to travel, although that hasn't completely stopped. We haven't completely had no face-to-face meetings. The UAE might actually, or the Saudis might, I mean, both sides, I think, might be trying to see how they can use whatever leverage they retain in Yemen on sort of their group or their interests within the coalition. And obviously, the success of the Amalika brigades before they were withdrawn, could give the UAE thinking that they could actually try to use this as a card at a future point in Yemen, perhaps not on the Houthi battlefront, but elsewhere. And the Saudis may be trying to think in the same way. So I don't think we'll see the same degree of cooperation and coordination, although I don't also think it was always that strong to begin with. And that the further away you got from the leadership in both countries, the more divergent those policies became in any way.
Thank you, Dr. Christian. وللدكتورة نادية سؤال.
And to Dr. Nadia, we have the question. I'll try to rephrase the question. In the war in Yemen in particular, and this is related to the dynamics in the region. Is there a party between Saudi Arabia and Iran which is weak in this conflict, or are they balanced in terms of their power?
Well, that is a good question. I think certainly, especially if there's a deal with the JCPOA, I do think that the leverage leans more towards Iran. But then now you want to talk about domestic politics between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis have consolidated quite amount of power in northern Yemen, and their territory is the majority of the population in Yemen is under their territory. But there's a lot of leverage behind the Saudis supporting the Hadi government. So I would say, let's say if there were no backers and it was a Yemen sort of discussion, at this point it appears that the Houthis have more leverage.
اوكي شكرا دكتورة دانيا. إذن بهذا نصل إلى اختتام.
Thank you, Dr. Dania. And by this we conclude day one of this conference. Once again, I would like to thank all those who struggled with us from the start until the end. We understand the difficulties associated with continuing online for so long, but actually the speakers navigated very different and interesting issues. This morning we started with an overview about the conflict actors in Yemen, and Peter Salisbury portrayed a picture about the trend lines in the conflict, the different actors, and the shifting balance of power in the past year and the future prospects of that. And then, as you have seen in details, we have in a presentation from Mesa Shuja'uddin about federalism in Yemen, and whether federalism is one cause of the conflict or could it be one of the solutions. Mr. Ibrahim Jalal discussed this side or topic and examined the NDC experience with the different strengths and weaknesses of it. That experience, which is, I believe, a unique experience in Yemen and probably in the region. And he discussed the associated dynamics with the NDC. Mr. Andy Carboni spoke in details about Ansarullah Group and the understanding of the transformations that happened to that group. That was the first panel, and I believe it portrayed a detailed map of the conflict. And then panel 2, this one was excellent in analyzing the different politics and the relations in Yemen, the Houthi-Iranian relations, and the Saudi-Emirati policies, and at the regional level, the Saudi-Iranian talks and the impact of that on the conflict in Yemen, and then the excellent presentation from Dr. Majid on the potential mediation from GCC countries in Yemen. So all these papers were valuable, and we thank all the speakers today for their time and for their insights. And we'd like also to thank the technical team which facilitated conducting this conference on Zoom and the live streaming of it. Yes, tomorrow will be the second and last day of this conference. We hope that we can see the same number and same level of interest. Tomorrow we will be talking in the opening session. We will have Mr. Abdul Malik Al-Ijri. He will present the views of Ansarullah and their allies concerning the peace process and the future of it. And the UN Special Envoy, Mr. Hans Grumbling, will speak. And then we will have 2 sessions, one about reviving the peace process, what are the lessons learned and the next steps. And the last panel will be the future of Yemen, recovery, reconstruction. Once again, I'd like to thank all the organizers, all the speakers, and I hope we can see you tomorrow. Goodbye.